Welcome to this week's OK at Work with myself, Sarah Sawyer, my colleague, Russell Berger, both attorneys at Offit Kurman. And today we are talking overtime calculations involving piece rates specifically. So a piece rate is something that often employers use to motivate employees to produce more work and paying it by the piece rate or by a certain block rate instead of an hourly rate for their time. There's a lot of different ways that you can pay employees, motivate them differently. But when you start getting into different ways of paying employees and different types of rates, that means that paying overtime might become a little bit more complicated. So what are some things that employers need to consider when they start considering different types of rate structures, Russell?
Yeah, and this is specific for non-exempt employees, but when you use something like a piece rate, which is, I'll pay you X dollars for completion of this unit, of this job, of this task. And you can have multiple tasks in a day, multiple tasks in a week. It can depend, but the key thing here is to remember that the overtime rate is calculated using kind of an hourly construct. But if you're not paying someone by the hour, you have to work back into that. So, for example, we think of overtime as time and a half. But the real question is time and a half of what? And the law says regular rate. Okay, what does regular rate mean? Regular rate means total compensation paid divided by total hours worked. And that's the regular rate of dollars per hour. If that's lower than minimum wage and you're paying someone on a piece rate or a day rate, for example, then you've got a minimum wage problem and you have to pay them more to get them to satisfy the minimum wage requirement for that pay period. If the person works overtime, and you might not have a minimum wage problem, but now you have to calculate an overtime premium. And what the law says is, like I just mentioned, you take all the piece rates or day rates accumulated for that week, and you would divide it by the hours worked in that week, and then you'd come up with a regular rate. Because you've paid that regular rate for all hours work, you've already paid the time portion of time and a half. So you would take half that rate and you would apply it to the overtime hours in that week. And what we see a lot of is that doesn't happen. We get answers like, well, the piece rate covers the time and a half of minimum wage, so I must be good, right? Or, I'm not paying them hourly, so I don't need to do this. And as I just explained, you do, and you have to go back and look at that.
And I think a lot of times, part of the reason that people fall into those issues is that they might be paying them a fairly high number as it relates to a day rate or a piece rate, and feel very comfortable that the employee is making a good amount of money for what they're doing. And so they make a practical assumption around, well, this seems like, they're making as much with just their piece rate as they would make if I paid them hourly and overtime together combined. So it must be okay. And it just doesn't work that way, unfortunately. So employers can really get themselves into trouble by providing a really high piece rate or a really high daily rate if the employees are working overtime, because you really want to kind of look at those calculations if someone's regularly working overtime before you set those rates and work your way backwards so you can know what that cost is going to be.
Yeah, it's I don't know, maybe a little more complicated than middle school algebra, but it's a math problem. Because at the end of the day, you want to pay X dollars to the employee for this work done. And if you think it's going to be, consistently a certain amount of overtime, or on average over the course of a longer period of time, some overtime is going to be included, then you just do the math and you set the piece rate at the appropriate amount for the hours you think are gonna be worked, and you can work that out. Alternatively, you can just say you have to do it in the 40 hours. I'm not going to pay. You're not allowed to work overtime. If you work it, we'll pay it, but we're going to discipline you because you're not allowed to go over 40. So there's different ways you can manage it from the employer perspective.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point to make, just that anytime you've got employees who are non-exempt, who are working overtime regularly, it's worthwhile to spend the time to sit down and do these math problems, think about it, think about the efficiency, think about what makes sense, how you're motivating employees, what the cost is going to be. And even though math can be scary, it's helpful in these situations.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thanks, Russell, and we'll talk next time. See ya.
Thanks, Sarah.